Thank you everyone for coming to see me and not wanting to go to a co-pilot session. So it's quite impressive. I thought I was going to get like 5 people, so I'm doing quite well. My name's Peter Baddeley. You can probably tell I'm from the UK. I'll talk about myself more in a minute. This session is about managing and auditing external access in Microsoft Teams. It's as much a learning session for me as it is for you. I've been to a few other sessions and people have been like, oh, I've been considering this session for like 2 years, planning it out. I just was like, one evening was like, oh, I'll do that. And just submitted a session and then they accepted it and I thought, better write it now and sort of learn about it. So that's what I did. No, seriously, it's an interesting session because there's so many different ways to share content out of Teams. And there's also a lot of challenges around how we manage that effectively and how we report on that. And that's something which I'm going to talk about today. Before I go any further, everyone will have banged on about sponsors. I have organised a few events like this myself in the past. These events don't happen without sponsors. They're the ones who are paying for these rooms. They're the ones who are paying for the lovely lunch which you just had. So go and speak to the sponsors. Not only is it nice to, but secondly, actually they have valuable things to talk to you about. They help you. You can't achieve everything in Microsoft 365 without the ISV community, so go and speak to those sponsors today. If you've had enough of listening to people like me, take a break, go and talk to some of the sponsors when it's a little bit less busy. In terms of the agenda, I've broken it down into a few different sections today. General introduction, I'm going to talk about the benefits and risks of external access to Microsoft 365 and Teams. Relatively simple, I think we probably all know that point. I'll go through the external access options. I'm hoping that at that point the demo will work and the internet will be back on. Someone sort of put their hand up or give me a thumbs up. Thumbs up when the internet comes back on. We'll then look at the 2 key aspects of this session today. So one of those is how we manage external access, how we can control it, the different types of external access. And then the last section is really on about auditing. So how do we actually report on who has access to our environment? How can we continue to report against that? Wrap up with a summary and we'll have some questions and answers. We might have a lot of questions at the end, hopefully, if this session gets done in 30 minutes. About myself. So this is me. My background is in the collaborative side of the Microsoft space, so in SharePoint, Microsoft 365, Teams. I've also got some background in Dynamics as well. My job, I have many, many hats. There's my hat. I won't subject you to me wearing my hat during the session. I'm Director of Microsoft Delivery at Efficiency. It's a company no one's heard of, unfortunately, but my job is to head up their sales and delivery side for their entire Microsoft practice. I was one of the founding team members of Provision Point, Microsoft 365 governance product, and I did say I did events like this, so amongst various events I organised was the SharePoint Saturday events in London, which was a lot of fun. Won't do it again, though. You can contact me anyway, Badass, website. It's not Twitter, it's X now, and LinkedIn. Google Badass. Once you hit a rapper who's not signed, sadly, you've gone too far. I always put this in about you. So I guess I don't really know what to ask in this conference. When I go to other events, I go like, oh, who's like an IT pro technical person? That's probably everyone here. What sort of the audience like today? So I guess there's obviously people who are more in the collaboration side of Teams, who sits in that sort of world. A couple of people who are more in the sort of UC comms side of Teams. Okay, interesting split. I don't know what everyone else is. End user, business user. Need developers. Oh, wow, fantastic. Okay, brilliant. Feel free to ask questions as we go through or save them up to the end. I don't mind. So what are the benefits and risks around sharing our information in Microsoft 365, and specifically Teams? So why do we want to do it? Why do we want to share information? Why do we want other people to have access? Well, because we want to work with people. We want to work with our customers. We want to work with our suppliers. We want to work with our partners. We want to work with our contractors. By getting them into our Teams environment, it's much easier to collaborate and work with them. We can use it for things like projects. Projects is the most common example we call out, but we can also do product launches, brand analysis, marketing campaigns, user feedback, engage our users and our customers in feedback. We can share an individual file. If we need to publish a press release, if we need to share some pricing information, some key assets, we can easily share one file of our environment. And we can extend that collaboration beyond one file. So instead of just sending that one file out, we can invite people into a channel or a team to collaborate. So we can have them chatting with us, we can have them editing that file, we can have them interacting with some of our apps as well. And there's some benefits. I decided to add a little bit of dash of orange to the slides. I've not done it too much, but I was sort of playing around with the colors, and I thought you can actually see this. It actually works quite well. So why do we use it, and what's the benefits of it? Well, firstly, and perhaps most significantly, removes the need to email files. In the past, we would have just emailed a file to 20 people. They would have all had different versions of it. They won't see that changing. So ensure everyone's working on the same version of the file as well. This is perhaps a really interesting one is, our IT pros, our IT administrators can be confident where the data is. We're not giving someone access, or some of our users aren't logging onto a Dropbox or Box account or Google Drive or some other service. They're logging onto somewhere where we can know securely who's got access to it, hopefully, but we can also be confident about where the data exists. So it will be in a Microsoft Azure data center appropriate to our tenant. It won't be in some other data locations, maybe outside of our jurisdiction. Maybe it breaches our privacy or data protection rules. We can then also, which is hopefully what we'll touch on in this session, we can also apply policies to secure and dispose of that data appropriately as well. So there's benefits to storing it within our team's environment. Oh, that's a danger of copy and paste, isn't it? The risks. It's easy to lose track of where our data is shared and who has access to it. There's a myriad of ways we can share data out of teams. There are many different teams. We have hundreds or thousands of users in our environment. We could have multitudes of guest users. We could have hundreds or tens of or thousands of files being shared. It's difficult to keep track of that as an IT administrator when we're stretched and we have lots of other tasks on our hands. Do our users actually know that something is shared? Do they know that the team they're working in, the channel they're working in, the file they're working in is actually shared with an external user? Are they confident that they're putting content in that repository which can be shared externally? You do need to have a robust life cycle for your data and ultimately your team as well, and the owners of those teams. So we need to make sure that the data is disposed of when it reaches the end of its life. If we're sharing a price list with our partners or our customers even, what happens when that's replaced? Are we confident and sure that the old price list is no longer available? What happens is if the person who's responsible for that team or data location leaves the organization and they're not managing the life cycle anymore? Last one is, typically, you can't control the life cycle of those external users. You can remove them from teams, but how do you know when to? How do you know when that employee has left another organization? So you don't manage that external user. So there's all these risks. It gives us lots of benefits. It makes it easy to collaborate, but it's a challenge to manage this data, to understand where our information is shared, and ultimately dispose of either the data or ultimately this external access. So, external access options, the different options which we've got for sharing information out of teams. Oh, sorry, this is the last bit of orange. So, there's three key buckets which we can share information out of: guest users, sharing links, and shared channels. So I'll dive into each one in a little bit more detail, but this just sort of summarizes what each one does, what they're good at doing, and maybe what they're a little bit bad at doing. So when we look at what do they do, guest users share a whole team, so more or less. There's some caveats there around private channels, or where there's restricted permissions. But in principle, you're adding the guest as a member to your team and they can access all of the information. Sharing links are used to share an individual file or folder. I'm sure we've all received those types of sharing links. Either we've shared them out or we've received a link to a file. Yeah? Or we can share a channel from a team, either within our own organization, but in this scenario, externally. So we can share a channel with another organization and they can log into it as if it's part of their teams. So what's it good for? Guest users are really great for non-Microsoft 365 users, because the bad side is you have to switch tenants, so it's not great. Yeah? Sharing links are good for where collaboration is not really required. You might want someone to comment on a document, read a document, make a few changes, but it's not designed for active collaboration within our Teams channel and chat. Shared channel is probably good when we're working with other people who have teams, because they can work within their tenant to access that channel. What's the restrictions, or what's the challenges? So generally when we're working with guest users, although the Teams client is much better at handling that now, we still have to do some element of switching to access that team. I have to move away from my current Teams environment, my Teams tenant, and switch to another one. It's relatively easy to do now, but I lose all of my other Teams and apps and chat, which are immediately around me. Sharing links, it's really hard to report on all of our sharing links. There's some reports now, but if you sat down and looked at a SharePoint site and tried to work out who has access to all of the sharing links, you wouldn't be able to. That's why me and Joy work for companies which help you do that, because it's a real pain, yeah? Shared channels, they can be right awkward. Who's had a bad experience with a shared channel? Yeah? Oh, not many. Who's had a good experience with a shared channel? Who doesn't use shared channels at all? Okay, so it's interesting. I was part of the shared channel for this event, the speak. Probably about 20% of the time it worked, and the rest of the time it didn't work. You can have all sorts of challenges. One day you can log in and files aren't available. Another day you can't log in at all. So shared channels can be a bit unreliable. Let's look at some examples of where we might use them before we continue. So guest users, I think it's great for things like contractors. Maybe it's someone who's using a personal Microsoft or a Gmail or even a Microsoft 365 account, but they're a one-man person. You're engaging that contractor. So they've not got their own extensive Teams environment, so it's not a massive barrier for them to be accessing your Teams environment. It's not that inconvenient for them, sorry. Sharing links. I mentioned the best examples before, so things like press releases, price lists, brochures, marketing material, where we want to share that on bulk with lots of people, either known people or even unknown people in scenarios, say, such as a press release. We want to share that with everyone. Shared channels are great working with a business partner, a supplier, someone who uses Microsoft 365, and we want to let them have access to some information. They want to stay within their Teams environment, so we're just collaborating with them on that and in that channel. Okay, let's have a look at what each of those do and the experience. If the internet mysteriously starts working, we'll have a look at it and see if it works. Yeah, question? We might get to that in a minute. Is it working well? We'll try. It might be better than my one. I've tried my one and it's a bit rubbish. It's fine. We'll go through the core of the slides and then we can always revert to demos at the end rather than switching back and forwards and waiting for connectivity. So, guest users. Who adds guest users to their Teams environment at the moment? A few people. So not so many people. Excellent. Hopefully you'll learn something today, even if it's just from my slides. So when we add a guest user, and there's a piece around how we can control whether guest access is enabled on our team or not. But when we add a guest user, we just need to type their email address. that will then add them as a guest, or send a request for them to be added as a guest. They're not added as a guest until they accept that invitation. They will receive an email, something like this. You can customize that email if you want to. And they must accept it before they get created as a guest. You can do things like enforce MFA on that guest account as well, so that they would have to do an MFA authentication to your tenant to be able to access that team. This slide is weirdly in dark mode, and it must be because I was preparing this late at night and I didn't notice that the screenshots were dark. It's the only one. And I ran out of time to change it. So what does the experience... So this is our experience of adding the guest, typing their name in, and this is what the guest user receives in terms of an email. This is what the guest sees when they access the team's environment. So they will actually see that team, they see that full team, the different channels within that team. If there are things like private channels, then they won't be able to access those unless they've been added to them. But they've got full functionality to access and collaborate within that team. The one thing which they will need to do is they will need to switch to access that. They will need to switch to that tenant which is attached to their user. So it's separate from where you have multiple tenants you log into. And you'll notice that when I switch to it, I'm a guest account within that team's environment. So that's guest users. Option 1. Option 2, sharing links. So remember, we're using guest users, gives me full access to the team. Sharing links is where I want to share a file or folder with one or more people. So I've selected a file. I choose I want to share it. I type in the email address of the person I want to share that file with. There's a few settings and options here. I can set, obviously, who I'm sharing it with. I can control the view or edit permissions. So we can control the default behavior around the permissions we're sharing with that link, but we can also change the settings. So I think by default, my setup is edit, but I might want to give someone just view permissions to that file. I can copy the link, in which case I just get a link. I can email it to someone, send it to a chat with someone. Alternatively, I can just email that link to someone and they'll receive it as an email. There are also additional settings I can control about that link. And that's what this looks like. So there are tenant restrictions available which control which options I can see here. So whether I share it with inside my organization, Contoso comes up a lot in demos today, doesn't it? Existing people who have access to that team, people I specify, so I can specify specific external people, or the anyone link. In this case, it's grayed out in this team because I haven't enabled it. I have to either enable it on my tenant or within my specific team. What does it look like for a user when they receive that? The experience around this can be marginally different depending on whether you're sending this to a Microsoft 365 account, an Outlook.com account, or a Google account. So there's nuances around how people are asked to verify identity, but it's largely the same. And also, it's much better than it used to be. So if anyone used these links before, it was quite complicated. Google users would have to set up accounts and stuff like that. It's now a much more streamlined process. So they will receive an email, something like this, saying, whoever shared a file with you, they will click on that link to open it. There will be some form of verification, often in the form of specifying your email address, and then that will email you a secondary code which you have to supply before they can access that link. So you've got that additional control and security out of the box with it. Third option, shared channels. My favorite and least favorite option. In principle, they're great, but it can be challenging. I just received a notification on my Apple Watch. That might mean the internet's working. We will see. We can share a channel with an external user. So firstly, we have to create the channel as a shared channel. First step. Secondly, there's a load of configuration which we have to do behind the scenes. We'll talk about that in a minute. Thirdly, you can then type in the email address to share that channel with a user. Yeah? Needs to be a Microsoft 365 user. And the user can access the channel from their tenant. So they can access it as if they are in their own Teams environment, and it will appear as a team and a channel, but just that channel in their Teams environment. So they can collaborate in chat and on files in that channel. In principle, it should be a lot more seamless. I haven't had to switch tenants. I can work within my existing environment. You can enforce things like MFA. That can cause challenges and problems if you've got different MFA policies between the two tenants, but you can enforce MFA on that as well. Any questions about any of those options?